What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. In the last 24 hours, we got a fresh Institute for the Study of War assessment showing that Russia is still pushing its offensive logic and still thinking in terms of buffer zones. We got Ukraine claiming a strike on the Feodosia oil terminal in occupied Crimea. We got reports that Russia intercepted 73 Ukrainian drones overnight, and we also saw new warnings tied to Transnistria, new threats from Moscow towards the Baltic states, and fresh ceasefire messaging from both Kiev and the Kremlin, after the Iran de-escalation changed the diplomatic atmosphere. And what makes this important is that these are not just some random headlines. Together, they show three things extremely clearly. First, the frontline remains active and exhausting, with Russia still trying to stretch Ukraine through constant pressure. Second, Ukraine is still trying to raise the cost for Moscow by hitting fuel, logistics and infrastructure that matter to the Russian war effort. And third, the political geography of the war may be widening once again, because Moldova, Transnistria, the Baltics, NATO nerves, cyber activity and ceasefire language are all appearing in the very same cycle of news. So today it's not just a regular frontline update. It is also an energy war update, a diplomacy update, and a map expansion update. And once you put those things together, the bigger question becomes extremely simple. Who is shaping the next phase of the war, and who is just reacting to it? The most important battlefield story today is not one giant breakthrough, but the pattern itself. The latest Institute for the Study of War assessment still frames Russia's effort around continued offensive activity and around the logic of creating buffer zones in Sumy Oblast along the international border. That matters because it shows that Moscow is still thinking in terms of strategic depth, territorial belts, and forcing Ukraine to defend more space rather than simply chasing one dramatic headline. That kind of warfare is not flashy, but it is how long wars slowly wear states down. If Ukraine has to keep watching a broader border, keep moving assets, keep rotating forces, and keep responding to uncertainty in multiple sectors, then Russia gains value even without some spectacular operational success. It keeps Kiev reacting, keeps commanders guessing, and keeps Western audiences looking at a map that refuses to settle down. That is why the language of buffer zones matters so much. Militarily, it means pushing outward where possible and creating more distance between Russian territory and Ukrainian strike capacity. Politically, it lets Moscow present its operations as security measures, instead of admitting that after years of war, it is still stuck in a grinding, attritional conflict with no easy way out. And then, alongside that, you have the overnight drone story inside Russia. Moscow said its air defenses intercepted 73 Ukrainian drones during the night between 8 p.m. on April 7th and 7 a.m. on April 8 Moscow time. Russian officials described them as aircraft-type unmanned aerial vehicles used in long-range strikes. Even if you treat Russian reporting carefully, the number itself is extremely important, because it shows that this pressure is persistent and geographically broad. And this is where most people go wrong. They hear about interceptions and think that the only issue is whether Russia stopped drones or not. But that is only half of the story. The other half is cost. Every wave still requires surveillance, readiness, air defense resources, command attention, messaging and disruption. The more this happens, the less secure the Russian rear really feels, even if many drones are intercepted before impact. So when you combine Institute for the Study of War's assessment of continuing Russian offensive logic with another night of large-scale drone pressure inside Russia itself, the message is extremely clear. This war is still expanding in psychological and logistical terms, even when the frontline map moves only slowly. And that takes us directly to the next chapter, because if Ukraine is not only pressuring Russia from the air, but also striking fuel infrastructure in Crimean peninsula itself and beyond, then the energy war becomes one of the most important parts of the whole story. And by the way, if you want to grab some The Russian Dude merch, you can do so at therussiandude.com. We have hoodies, obviously, t-shirts, pants, shorts, hats, accessories, pretty much everything you can think of. The link is down below. Thank you so much. Now let's continue. Here's where it gets interesting, because Ukraine said on April 8 that it struck Russia's oil terminal in occupied Crimea, specifically the terminal in Feodosia. Reuters said Drone Forces commander Robert Brovdi described it as the largest maritime oil terminal on the peninsula. And that is important, because Crimea is not just politically symbolic in this war anymore. It is a logistics platform, a military support area, and a fuel hub for the entire Russian operation. If that terminal is being hit, the story is bigger than just one strike. It is about whether Ukraine can keep imposing costs on the support structure behind Russian operations in Crimea and the south of Ukraine. Reuters noted that the facility plays an extremely important role in supplying fuel to Russian troops on the peninsula itself, which means the strike has both military and political value. And this was not an isolated case. Reuters' broader summary of Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy sites shows the scale of the campaign. NORSI, for example, Russia's fourth largest refinery owned by Lukoil, we spoke about briefly yesterday, suspended operations on April 5th after Ukrainian drone strike. That refinery can process 16 million metric tons of oil per year, or around 320,000 barrels per day. The Kirishi refinery, after fires in late March, was reported to be restarting only partially at around 60% of nominal primary capacity. Reuters also said Novatek's Ust-Luga complex suspended gas condensate processing and naphtha export loadings after a fire. Company data shows it processed 8 million tons of gas condensate in 2025. Ukraine also said it struck the Bashneft Nova Oil refinery near Ukhta, more than 1,400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And that facility can process more than 7 million tons of oil per year. And the list keeps growing. Reuters said the Saratov refinery's crude distillation unit has remained shut after March 21st strike, while in 2024 that refinery processed 5.8 million metric tons of oil, about 2.2% of entire Russian refining. The Ilsky refinery with annual capacity of 6.6 million tons had a fire in February. Volgograd, owned by Lukoil, was completely shut down on February 11th after drone attacks, with CDU-1 unit accounting for roughly 40% of its total capacity. In 2024, Volgograd processed 13.7 million tons. Reuters also pointed to fires or pressure at the Ukhta refinery, which processed about 3 million tons in 2025, and at Ilsky, which processed 7.2 million metric tons, or 144,000 barrels per day in 2024. Then you get to export infrastructure. Novorossiysk, Shikharis, and Primorsk all come under pressure. Primorsk can handle up to 1 million barrels per day and reportedly lost at least 40% of its capacity in attacks last month. Once you look at all of this together, Ukraine's strategy becomes much easier to understand. When the land front is difficult and manpower is finite, long-range strikes let Kiev create pressure somewhere else, in maintenance costs, for example, shutdowns, delays, repairs, and fuel risk. This does not mean that Russia's energy system is suddenly collapsing overnight. That would be, just way too simplistic assumption, unfortunately, I would say. Russia still has major depth, large production, and the capacity to recover from individual attacks. But that is not really the point. The point is cumulative pressure. If Ukraine keeps forcing repairs, dispersal, air defense protection, and political explanations, then Moscow has to spend way more resources defending its industrial rear while still funding a very expensive war. There is also a signaling dimension here. Russia wants to project stability, endurance, and control. Ukraine, on the other hand, wants to show that it still has reach and that occupied Crimea, maritime terminals, and major refineries are not out of reach anymore. So strike on Feodosia is not only about physical damage. It is also about telling Russian planners, Russian audiences, and Ukraine's Western backers that the war's cause can still be pushed deeper into Russian-controlled space. And once you see the war that way, the next chapter becomes even more serious. Because the geography of pressure may not be limited just to frontline and energy facilities. It may also be widening towards Moldova and Transnistria. Now here's where things get tricky, because one of the most consequential stories in this briefing may be the one that did not dominate every headline. According to the Kyiv Independent, Deputy Presidential Office head and former commander Pavlo Palisa said that Russia is planning to establish a buffer zone in Moldova's Russian-occupied Transnistria region, alongside the border with Ukraine's Vinnytsia Oblast. He said this in an interview with RBK Ukraine published on April 8th. And that matters immediately because Transnistria has been under Russian occupation since 1992 and lies along Ukraine's Odesa and Vinnytsia Oblast. The frontier in that area stretches more than 400 kilometers or 250 miles. So the moment Transnistria comes back into active strategic language, Ukraine, Moldova and NATO capitals all have to start recalculating risks immediately. The key issue is not whether Russia is about to open some giant new campaign there tomorrow morning. The key issue here is that even the credible possibility of another pressure zone forces attention, planning and defensive calculations. And that is exactly how long wars work. Sometimes you simply do not just need a new front line. You only need the possibility of one in order to tie down the other side. And the geography here is not random either. Odesa is one of Ukraine's most sensitive strategic regions economically and politically. Moldova remains one of the most vulnerable non-NATO states in Europe when Russian regional pressure rises. So if Transnistria becomes more active as a lever, Moscow could unsettle Moldova, force Ukraine to think more serious about its southwest, and remind Europe that Russia still has old influence structures that can become useful again when the timing is right. There is also a broader pattern here. If you hear Russian strategic language about buffer zones in more than just one geography, whether in Sumy near the Russian border or in the relation to Transnistria, then the pattern itself starts to matter. Buffer zone logic is really about shaping space, stretching defenses and controlling uncertainty. It does not guarantee successful implementation, but it shows intent. And once you start seeing that pattern, the Baltic story becomes much easier to understand. Because Moscow is not only pressuring Ukraine's map directly, it is also leaning into intimidation around NATO's eastern edge. If you think that's interesting, well, wait until you hear what happened next. Because while Ukraine has intensified strikes on Russian energy infrastructure near the Baltic coast, Moscow is again escalating its rhetoric towards Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. According to Euronews, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said that the Baltic states, quote-unquote, have received an appropriate warning, and then added that if their regimes do not listen, once again quote-unquote, they will have to deal with the response, while refusing to specify what that response would be. Moscow has accused Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania of opening their airspace for Ukrainian forces and drones, and therefore, as a result, helping Kiev strike Russian Baltic ports. The Baltic governments reject those claims as disinformation, obviously. But what matters here is not whether the accusation is credible. What matters is that the accusation creates a narrative breach for Moscow between Ukrainian strikes and a broader confrontation zone. In very simple terms and plain English, the Kremlin is saying that if infrastructure near the Baltic is being hit, then it may not frame this only as a Ukrainian story, as a Ukrainian attack. This is not the same thing as a real military escalation, obviously, but it is definitely a rhetorical escalation meant to create pressure and ambiguity. Euronews added that 2 Ukrainian drones flew into Latvia and Estonia during a mass overnight attack on March 25th. That happened during one of Ukraine's biggest deep strike waves, and 2 major Baltic Sea targets were reportedly hit, a terminal in Ust-Luga and a military icebreaker in Vyborg. Ust-Luga, one of Russia's largest Baltic export hubs, has been hit repeatedly, and explosions were seen near the port again. Once you combine that with Reuters reporting on pressure against Ust-Luga, Primorsk and other export infrastructure, the Baltic angle stops looking like a random flare-up and starts looking like a structural vulnerability from Moscow's point of view. Russian exports, military logistics and regional signaling are all overlapping there. And this is exactly why this story matters so much. Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna said that Western countries must keep Ukraine as a priority and increase pressure on Russia even as the US-Iran conflict draws attention away from Europe's largest war since 1945. Tsahkna said that Iran has long been a European and global problem and also a direct threat to Estonia because Iran has been one of Russia's key supporters in the war against Ukraine. And that is a very important point, because from the Baltic perspective, these are not 2 completely separate crises. They are linked. If the West gets distracted by the Middle East and Ukraine slips lower on the priority list, then only Moscow benefits. So the Baltic story is not only about Zakharova threatening NATO's eastern flank. It is also about alliance attention, discipline, and whether Europe can stay focused while another crisis pulls headlines away. And that takes us directly into the diplomacy chapter, because once the Iran ceasefire changes the international atmosphere, both Kiev and Moscow suddenly start using the same word once again, which is the ceasefire. But they're not talking about the same thing. You will see what I mean in the next chapter. Here's something most people do not expect, because the same regional de-escalation that shifted global attention towards Iran also reopened a diplomatic conversation around Ukraine. Reuters reported that President Volodymyr Zelenskyy welcomed the Iran de-escalation and said Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire with Russia if Moscow holds its strikes. Reuters then said that Zelenskyy described ceasefires as foundations on which peace agreements then later can be built. I mean, that sounds obvious and simple, but Ukraine is trying to do two things at once. It wants to sound constructive, so nobody can easily accuse Kiev of blocking diplomacy, but it also wants to keep clear conditions in place. Zelenskyy is not saying that Ukraine is ready for some vague pause while Russian attacks continue. He is saying that Ukraine is ready if Russia actually stops. Then Reuters also noted an interesting detail that many people probably missed. Ukraine has sent more than 200 specialists to the Middle East to help counter Iranian drone threats. And that matters because it shows how connected these conflict zones have become. Ukraine is not just reacting to Iran in some distant issue. It is now involved fully physically in the broader security ecosystem shaped by Iranian drone technology and Russian use of it. Then comes Moscow's version of events. Reuters reported that Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Russia welcomes the Iran ceasefire and hopes that in the foreseeable future, the United States will have more time and greater opportunity to resume talks in a trilateral format with Russia and Ukraine. Reuters added that Russia had previously argued that peace talks were paused because of the outbreak of hostilities in Iran, and that earlier meetings had taken place in Istanbul, Abu Dhabi, and Geneva. On paper that sounds constructive. But then comes the real problem. Reuters pointed out that progress has been blocked by Russia's demand that Ukraine should give up the rest of Donbass, something that Kyiv obviously rejects, especially because Russian forces still have not fully seized the territory even after more than 4 years of war. So here is the crucial distinction. Both sides are using ceasefire language, but they are not really describing the same diplomatic reality. For Kyiv, a ceasefire means actual restraint and an actual reduction of attacks. For Moscow, ceasefire language often appears alongside territorial demands and political conditions that make a very real agreement extremely difficult, if not possible at all. That is why every time you hear that talks may resume, you have to ask the boring but necessary question. Talks about what exactly? On whose terms? And with what enforcement? Because meetings are not the same as progress. In many cases, they are simply another arena where both sides try to look reasonable while preserving leverage. But still, even limited diplomatic movement matters. It affects alliance expectations, media attention, and the political mood around the war. And once you combine that with the military stories we already covered, the next chapter becomes way more important. Because the war is not only being fought through trenches and energy terminals, it is also being fought through networks, cyber reach, and the struggle to hold international attention. Let's talk about it in our final chapter. But here is the catch. The battlefield is no longer only trenches, artillery, drones, or fuel depots. It is now also routers, ministries, critical infrastructure, alliance coordination, and the ability to hold political focus when another conflict is dominating the global headlines. On April 7, the US Justice Department announced a court-authorized disruption of a DNS hijacking network controlled by Russia's GRU military unit 26165. Reuters reported that the operation, called Operation Masquerade, involved hijacked routers used against targets in military, government, and critical infrastructure sectors. The effort affected thousands of routers worldwide. The FBI said compromised devices in the United States were reset, while Microsoft identified more than 200 organizations and 5,000 consumer devices impacted. The takedown involved partners in more than 15 countries. That matters because it shows how broad the competition really is. The same Russian state that pressures border regions, threatens the Baltic, and continues offensive operations is also engaged in cyber and intelligence activity aimed far beyond the immediate front line. Reuters said the targets included military, government and critical infrastructure sectors, while Lumin's Black Lotus Labs said the operation affected ministries of foreign affairs, law enforcement and email providers. This is not a side story anymore, as you can see. It's a part of the same conflict ecosystem. The war is being fought through military pressure, fuel pressure, cyber access, state messaging and diplomatic timing all at once. The line between battlefield and non-battlefield has become much weaker. And then you can dig back to Margus Tsakhnar's warning. He said Western governments must keep Ukraine a priority even as Iran dominates headlines. That sounds obvious, but strategically it may be one of the biggest questions in the entire moment. Can Ukraine hold military, financially and political focus while another major crisis competes for attention? Can Europe keep explaining why Ukraine remains the central security question on the continent? And can Moscow benefit from distraction even without major gains on the battlefield this week? Those are not some abstract random questions. They affect aid, diplomatic bandwidth, weapons flows, public patience and alliance discipline. Russia benefits if Ukraine starts feeling like old news, expensive news, tiring news, background news. But Ukraine then, on the other hand, benefits of each strike on Feodosia, each refinery disruption, each Baltic warning and each diplomatic signal reminds Western capitals that this war is still dynamic and still central to European security. So when you look at Operation Masquerade, at Tsakhnar's warning, at the drone waves and at the energy strikes, the pattern becomes, well, pretty clear. This war is not narrowing, it is only broadening in layers. And that is the key thing viewers you guys need to understand going forward. Well guys, if you enjoyed, if you found this useful, please subscribe to my channel, like this video. If you wish to support our work, the links are below, Patreon, PayPal donations, merch. Thanks so much. See you.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe